Good day, everyone, and welcome to the Atlantic Trades Business Certificate. And this module is Operations Management, and this topic is Job Costing Estimating. My name is Paul Tilley, and I'm your instructor for this course, and I'd like to take you through this now. So, what we're going to do is we're going to look at how we can estimate a cost of a job so that we can price it, and effectively be able to do this using techniques that we'll review here. So in terms of job cost estimating, as I say, we've looked at this idea of basic methodology for price setting in marketing and sales. And we really broke it down into 6 basic steps then, which is like, what are our pricing constraints? What are our objectives? You know, what limits us in terms of the lowest price we can charge or maximum price that we can charge? What do we want to do? Do we want to make a lot of money or sell a lot of product? That's what we mean by objectives. We've got to estimate the demand and estimate our revenue. And again, if we're selling multiple items, that's pretty straightforward. You need to say, how many potential units can we sell? And based on that, what do we expect our revenues to be? Determine the relationship between our costs, our sales volume, and our profits, which is just kind of integrating. If we make 10 units, what will our costs be related to 10 units? And is that profitable enough to continue? That's basically what that is looking at. Select an appropriate price level. We looked at the idea of setting a sticker price on something and then adjusting it as we make adjustments for good customers or seasonal discounts or these sorts of things. Now, this is a standard method that most products that are sold in volume are priced at. This is this method that we looked at prior to. And it works great for those type of items, retail type items. But what we're talking about in this particular unit is one of, okay, or minimum number of. So we don't really have what's called standard pricing to look at. We need to be able to estimate what it's going to cost. So it's no different than I call you and say, hey, could you paint my house? And you say, well, where do you live? How big is the house? You know, it really depends. Is my house a big house, small house? Is the paint, is there a large paint area, a small paint area? There's so many factors that are different from one house to another that you as a painter would have to come and look at my house, size up what I need done, put a price on that, and offer it up to me to say, well, you know, are you willing to pay this? So that's really what we're looking at in this particular section. The trick is with estimating is you need to do it quickly. You know, someone is not going to want to wait around for weeks for you to develop an estimate on price. So it needs to be fast. It needs to be accurate, meaning that from the customer's point of view, if you tell them it's going to cost $1,000, the price should come in at around $1,000. If it's $10,000 after you told them $1,000, man, that's not going to be good. So the accurate thing from a customer's point of view is important, but it's also important from your point of view as a seller, because let's assume that you say, okay, I'll paint your house for $1,000, but then you find out as you're doing it that really you're putting a lot more work than $1,000 worth of work into it. So you've underestimated. And that's not so good for you as the supplier of the product. So being accurate means not only for the customer, but for yourself as well. And finally, an estimate must be understandable. The customer has to have a good understanding of how you arrived at that price. And that legitimizes it in the customer's mind, and it clarifies what needs to be done and how it's going to be processed. So job cost estimating really comes into play whenever we got this non-standard, one-of type situation where we're trying to get a good determination of how much it's going to cost to do something, what price should we charge in order to make a reasonable profit on it, okay? So we need to kind of get a good handle on our costs, figure out how much money we want to make on it, and then set our prices accordingly. When we think about costs are really made up of 2 separate things. The 2 separate things are something called variable cost and something called fixed cost. If we think about variable costs change depending on how many units of something we produce, or how many gallons of paint we put on the wall, or how many hours it takes to paint the wall. Variable costs vary with the size of the project. And things like labor, units of raw material, all are what are considered variable because they change depending on the size of the product. The other type of costs that we have in terms of our estimating, which is a little harder to get your head around, are fixed costs. Now, fixed costs are the basic costs that you're going to incur to do the job you're doing, okay? And you need to, in your job, be able to apportion a certain amount of your fixed cost to an individual contract. Let's continue with the painting example. Let's assume you bought a ladder in order to be able to do some painting. Now, you're not buying a ladder for every single project. In fact, that ladder will probably do you for 3 years or 30 projects. So what you need to be able to do is to expense out the cost of that ladder over that period of time. This is what we mean by fixed cost. It doesn't change if you paint one house or if you paint 30 in that 2-year life of the ladder. Really, you need to be able to recoup the cost of the ladder. So fixed costs are the costs for your equipment. We'll call it the basic things that you require in order to be in business. So if you needed a car, if you needed a ladder, if you needed scaffolding, if you needed any of the materials that are used on multiple projects. You could say, well, I can use a paintbrush for a year. Well, okay, in that case, it would be a pretty fixed cost. Now, if you use a disposable paintbrush, that would be a variable cost because the more projects you have, the more paintbrushes you have to buy. Now, not all of this is cut in stone, so you have to ask yourself when you're doing first of all, when you're doing an estimate, is this a variable cost or is it a fixed cost? And you need to consider both of those. Two of them together, your total variable cost, all your variable costs added up, and all your fixed costs added up will give you your total costs. And that is important in order to be able to put a price on something. You need to know what your total costs are in order to be able to price something properly. So as I say, cost considerations in estimating or quoting a price involve things like materials. Materials are the stuff that you need in order to be able to do the project. So for example, if you're a painter, you're going to have to buy some paint. You're going to have to buy plaster. You're going to have to buy painter's tape. All of these sorts of things are what you're going to consume as you do the painting. Labor is another important process within a project. You have to consider how long it's going to take you to do the job. And you want to be recouped on let's say, a per hour basis. So if you estimate that it's going to take you 10 hours to do something, whatever your rate per hour is, say $30 an hour for 10 hours, well, you're going to have to charge $300 for labor. And the longer it takes, the more labor is going to be required. The longer it takes, the more materials are going to be required. Again, these are all variable. Quoted items, all quoted items mean is, well, the person asks you to do this, that, and the other thing. I want you to paint my bedroom. I want you to paint my bathroom. I want you to paint my kitchen. These are all of the things. The more quoted items that you add in, obviously, the more the project is going to be. If I ask you to paint one room, it's different than having to paint 4 rooms. There are contingencies too. Contingencies are the unknowns. Most all people who estimate put in a contingency of approximately 10%. These are unknowns. You did not know or unexpected that you might hit. So let's say, for example, you're asked to paint a room and you realize that it's oil paint on it and you need to buy some of this, I'll call it primer type paint that you hadn't anticipated. Okay, so you need to put on this painting on oil primer. So that costs you $30 over and above what you expected. Well, if you build in a contingency into your price, you can afford to be able to make those mistakes. So contingency is just covering off for potential, not necessarily mistakes, but it could be mistakes, but it could be other things that come up. Statutory fees and charges. If there's a fee, for example, the town might require you to have a permit, and that would be a statutory fee. So you'd have to go buy the permit. Now, you don't want to swallow the cost of that. You're going to build that into your price. Holding charges. This could be anything from interest rates. For example, if I ask you to paint my house, but I don't want you to do it until December, you go buy the materials now, theoretically you could incur some costs because of that in terms of interest or like. The other side of the coin looks at fixed costs. Now you have to consider, what are my fixed costs? So as I say, if you got ladders, or if you got scaffolds, or you got all those things that are required in order to be able to do the job you do, those would all be considered as fixed costs because you can use those over multiple projects. And you want to figure out what are your fixed costs. Now, every fixed cost or every situation will be different, but you have to figure out what costs are variable, the materials, the labor, contingencies, these sorts of things. And you have to figure out what costs are fixed. So it requires sitting down and giving all this a lot of consideration beforehand. You also need to factor in, okay, so those are your expenses. You got your variable cost expenses, your fixed cost expenses. Then you also want to consider, how much profit do you want to make on something? Let's assume that you want a 30% profit. So whatever your costs are, you add up all of these things, you can come up with a cost, let's say, of $1,000. So the cost of painting the rooms that I asked you to paint is $1,000. That's your cost. You're going to say, well, I want a 30% return. So that means you're going to have to add $300 to that cost, and that will come up then with, that $300 will constitute your profit, and it will come up with a price effectively of $1,300. So you say to me, Paul, it's going to cost you $1,300 in order to do this work. You make $300 out of it, $1,000 goes to the expenses of completing the work. Again, it requires a sit down and some consideration in terms of coming up with the estimate. Now, the question that some people ask too is, what is the difference between an estimate and a quote? Sometimes you get a quote from sometime, but you get an estimate. And from a legal perspective, you need to be aware of what the differences are between a quote and an estimate. An estimate is a non-binding guess. If you say to me, Paul, I estimate it would cost me about $1,000 to paint the rooms that I asked you to paint. So you tell me, I estimate it to be $1,000. Okay? That's what you think the cost will be to do it. So you give me an estimate based on a guess, based on not a lot of consideration, based on, I caught you in the store and I asked you to paint my house and I asked you, how much do you think that's going to cost? That's really what we consider an estimate. I can't hold you that price. Obviously, I want you to be in the ballpark of that price, but I can't hold you to that price. So an estimate is, from a legal perspective, a non-binding price that you give someone that can be plus or minus some amount, a reasonable amount, over and above. As you get more experience at doing work, your estimates will become much closer to reality. Okay, but the other thing that you want to consider is, okay, sometimes people want to quote, like businesses or the town or government is going to want to quote. And what a quote is a guarantee price. There's the difference between an estimate, which is non-guaranteed, and the quote, which is guaranteed. So if I asked you for a quote to paint those rooms, you're going to give it a lot more consideration than an estimate. You're going to have to come to my house, you're going to have to size it up, and you're going to have to come back to me with a written amount that says $1,300. From a contractor's point of view, obviously prices can change, and you have to have some freedom to let the quote die, more or less. In other words, you quote something, the price that you quote is only good for 30 days. So in most contract law, a quote contract will only be for about 30 days. So the point of this whole topic then is, how do we create a reasonable estimate or a reasonable quote? How do we do that for the one-offs? Well, first of all, we look at this estimating. And as I said, estimating is not the one that everybody goes to and says, this is the one that I'm going to hold you to. An estimate is a best guess. Now, how do you come up with a reasonable estimate, though? Well, education and experience is best. So the more you do something, the better you get at it. So if you look at someone who's been in the trade for years and years and years in terms of coming up with price, they're very good at what they do, and that we can pretty well assure that the estimate is going to be fairly reasonable and fairly reliable in terms of what the cost is going to be. If you're new to something or you live in an environment that's constantly changing, an estimate is probably not as, it's probably a little more fluid, I should say. So education getting familiar with the concept of how to create a good estimate, or just plain old experience. You've done a lot. You've been down the block, are good. Keeping an accurate record is important because if you can keep a good record of all your past projects, it helps build a database of information for future projects. So if you know, for example, that it takes you on average 1 day to paint a room or 1 hour to build a chair, based on your experience, you can use that as a good estimate for future projects. Record all creditor invoices. Sometimes you don't get a really good handle on what your actual costs are unless you record all creditor invoices. Make sure you keep track of what your actual costs are, and that will help you in the future refine your quotes and estimates. And you're obviously going to be comparing your actual costs with your estimates too. If you estimate $1,000, you keep giving bills out for 30% more than that, you're going to have to say, maybe I should revise my estimates to be a little bit more accurate. And that's the final thing. Really, based on experience, you make your adjustments to your estimates to make them more reflective of the actual cost. So that's the advice. And here's the basic steps that anyone who's job estimating needs to go through. You got to consider the job, first of all. And what you got to do with any given job that you estimate. So you come in, you look at my house, and you say, okay, you want 4 rooms painted, Paul. Here's the type of paint you want to use. These are the various considerations. You break all that down. So room 1 is so many square feet. Room 2 is so many square feet. Room 3, so many square feet. Room 4, so many square feet. And based on that, you can estimate the total square footage that you would have to paint and be able to convert that into how many cans of paint you're going to need, how much time it's going to take to do, and so on. So break the task into their various parts. The list of materials that you're going to be using. Again, with experience, you have a much better handle on doing this sort of thing, but you really need to be able to consider what are the basic materials that I need to do a job. How much of something am I going to need? How many gallons of paint? How many paintbrushes? How many rollers? And the costs would flow from that. Estimate the hours it's going to take to do it. This is one where I fall down all the time. I find that it's relatively easy to cost out the products that you're using, your materials. It's much harder, though, to estimate the hours, because you realize that as you get better at something, you can do it more quickly. I'm not very good at anything. I always underestimate how long it's going to take me to do something. So one of the things that you need to really consider is how long is it going to take you to do this, and to be able to create a realistic estimate of it. If you got a bunch of young painters, for example, and you're painting, well, you might be able to do it in an hour, but can those young painters do it in an hour? Those are the things that you need to consider. Subcontractors. Sometimes you need to get subcontractors in. If you're building a house, for example, electricians, plumbers, these sorts of things. You want to know how much it's going to cost to get them to do the project, and you're going to build that into your price. Any other items that you need to purchase? Again, things like permits, rentals, porta potties, whatever you need on the job site, insurance. Those things all need to be considered. Those are largely fixed costs, but again, you need to consider what they are. So you list it all out. You can go back through your lists and you size it all up to make sure you got it done right. And hopefully you got someone who has some experience with this, and give them your list and get them to double check it to make sure that it's right and that the math is done right. That's a big problem with a lot of people, is they don't add up things properly, and as a result, their estimate is off, or their quote is off, even worse. So in order to prepare a written estimate, then, what I have here is a little graphic that shows a typical work estimate. And a work estimate, if you go into Microsoft Word or any of the word processing programs, you will find that there are templates in there, or Google it on the internet. There are lots of examples of templates out there that you can get that allow you to do this. And you'll notice that all these estimates tend to have common features. They have the name of your company. They have the overall price, the breakdown, a schedule in terms of time, the basic terms and conditions, period which the estimate is valid for, and the payment terms. So a lot of those things should be included in any work estimate that you give someone. Again, you don't want to spend a lot of time doing a work estimate. It is a good guess. It's not cast in stone, but those are the basic things that you want to put on it. And as I say, there's lots of templates out there that you can use. Now, the more complicated one is a quote, and the quote requires you to be able to do a much more fine assertion of how much it's going to cost you to do something. So you got to be careful with quotes, because a lot of businesses will come out and ask for quotes. They do a request for quotes or something like that. And you got to be careful to make sure you read it carefully to ensure that you're quoting the right things, okay? So they commit you to a price, and if you're not clear on what the job asks you to do, it could cost you a lot of money, because you could think that they want to do something, but they actually want you to do a lot more or less. And again, that can cause you to have a mismatch between what your costs are and what you're quoted. I have a little sample of the quote here, very similar to the estimate, but it lays out the overall price, the breakdown of the components of the price. You know, if you go get your car work done, for example, you'll notice that the garages give you this sort of thing. So it's a breakdown of what parts are required, how much parts cost, how much time is going to take in order to do the work, these sorts of things. And again, this quote gives you some assurance that that is the price that you're going to charge. And from a buyer's point of view, that's how much it's going to cost to do the work. Businesses also do a lot of work through what's called tenders. Now, a tender is really asking you to develop a quote. That's all it is. So if you provide goods and services to other businesses, or particularly the government sector, you'll have to compete for a tender. You need to think about a tender in terms of what are the component costs, the time in terms of staff and costs, and something that you need to build into. And all these have management time, administration time, expenses in terms of times of issuing, the time you, let's say, for example, you do this work, but you're not going to get paid for 3 months. So it's $15,000 worth of work you're going to do. You're not going to get paid. You need to consider, what are my expenses in that in terms of interest and the like. And a lot of companies will wait a while to get paid. So you need to factor that into the price of your tender. As opposed to a tender, there is something that is a little less, but a little more common, and usually for smaller projects, and that's a request for proposals. And it's very similar. Effectively, what it does is we will go out to, a government or someone will issue a request for proposals to anyone out there who is qualified to do something, to submit a proposal for, supply of gardening equipment or any number of things. So it's very similar to a tender. However, it's probably not as formal as a tender. Okay, we need to seek these things out from a government point of view all the time. And again, as a supplier, you need to consider what your costs are and be able to estimate your costs, factor in contingencies, factor in profit, and from there submit a proposal for a project with a price that is competitive. Finally, what I wanted to look at was operationalizing all this stuff we talked about. This is what I wanted to get to in terms of the mechanics. Okay, using spreadsheets is a useful tool. It's beyond the scope of this course, but if you're not familiar with how to use spreadsheets, it is something that you should do, because a spreadsheet is a useful tool for doing this cost estimation. Here, for example, I'll just use a spreadsheet to consider this example I got here. Assume you operate a small machinery company, Northern Machining. you've been asked by a client to repair a stripped gear in a gearbox, okay? And I've got the gear there, showing it stripped and everything. So what do you need to do? You think about it and you say, okay, a stripped gearbox. Okay, the gearbox comes in, assuming that the gearbox comes into your shop, okay? You don't need to take anything else apart. You need to take the gearbox apart, clean the parts, grind the broken gear, weld the gear, machine the teeth in the gear, and reassemble the gearbox. So we just kind of break it down into its basic stages, okay? Each one of those basic stages take a certain amount of material and a certain amount of time. One of the things that we can do is to create what's called an estimating template. And a lot of companies do this. If you're in a specific type of business, you can use this template. So what a spreadsheet does, it's a glorified calculator, I call it in its basic terms. What we have here is an estimating template. What I've done is I've taken, okay, here are all the materials. You'll see these are materials. And below is labor. And below that is the profit margin that you build in. Okay? So let's just take a look at materials required to fix that gear. Okay, we look at the gear, and you say, as a professional machinist, you're going to say, well, I'm going to need some welding rods, I'm going to need some steel, I'm going to need some grease, I'm going to need new seals, and potentially other things. So you as a person then would say, okay, how much do I just want you to look at this column, the cost column. Each welding rod costs $10. Each piece of steel costs $30. Each seal costs $5. Oh, sorry, each grease is $5, and seals are $25. And what I've done is to say, okay, how many quantities of those things do we need? Well, looking at the gear, we need 5. Now, I can change it to 4 here, and you can see it will automatically do the calculation, the spreadsheet. So I'm going to go back to 5. So I got a quantity of 5 welding rods at $10 each, gives me a total cost of $50. 1 grease at $5, total cost of $5. 1 seal at $25, total cost $25. So if I look at the parts that are required in order to fix that gear, there's $110 worth of parts, or material, I'll call it, material for this. Now, what I've done here is I've added in something called indirect costs. Now, I talked about this idea of a contingency before, and really I'm just adding 10%. So if my materials, I estimate materials are $110, I'm going to give myself a 10% slack, indirect costs. It could cover off some of the fixed costs, could whatever, but I'm adding in an additional 10%. So 110 plus the 10% of that, which is $11. So my total material cost for the purposes of the estimate is $121. Okay? Now, labor, which is really where our major costs come in. It's going to take a welder, and the welder is going to take a half an hour to set it up, is going to take an hour to do the work, and the charge per hour, or the welder's charge, is $25. So effectively you got 1.5 hours, a half hour for setup, and 1 hour, 1.5 hours for a total of $37.50 in terms of costs. The machining, half hour setup, 1 hour, cost charge per hour is $30, costs $45. The disassembly and assembly, it's going to take, let's say, a total of an hour set up and 5, take it apart, put it together, basically half an hour, $25 per hour, 1 hour times 25, $25. So you can see our total labor costs is $107.5. So our total costs, and if we look at the material, $121, and their labor is $107. So our total material and labor cost is $228. Now, in order to rationalize fixed costs, or to be able to, to expense off our fixed costs, what I've done in this company is say that total, we're going to charge 30% of total materials and labor as what I call overhead, which is really just a fancy word for expensing away our fixed costs. The lathe, the welding machine, all that stuff, we're just expensing it away. So the total cost then, that's 30% of the total materials, which is $68.55. So the subtotal is $297.05. So what we're saying there is it'll cost just about $300 in order to fix that gear. That's what it'll cost you, the machine shop. It's going to cost you $300 to fix that gear. You want to make a profit on that. And your general rule of thumb is that you want to make a 25% profit on your total expenses. So our total expenses is just about $300, $297.05. So 25% profit margin is $74.26. You take your $297 and you add in your $74. So the total price of that project, someone walked in your store and said, okay, I want you to fix this. You're going to give them a price quote or an estimate, depending on what you consider it to be. If it's an estimate, you're flexible on it. If it's not, if it's a quote, this is the price, $371. Now, the advantage of using a spreadsheet is you can do this very quickly. And if you got standard rates, most places have standard rates, how long it takes to do something, for example, or how much it costs. This allows you to mathematically figure out how much it's going to cost to do something and how much the price is going to be on it. And anyone look at, a customer wouldn't necessarily see your rates or your markups, but you, from your point of view, it is a rational method of which you can develop your prices. And as a result of that, I would strongly suggest that you have some sort of a spreadsheet system or a system for calculating your prices, such as this. So again, the basic core of it is get your materials, get your labor, add the two of those together, add in an overhead factor to cover off fixed costs, add in a profit factor to cover off your profit, and voila, you can calculate your pricing from there.